Now, there are many diverging opinions on what great architecture should be, and it can be quite hard to decide which side of a debate to take on when trying to figure out whether the building has an architectural merit or not. Now, on the other hand, our intuition is quite good at telling us whether a specific building is somewhere we would like to spend our time in. So why is it so? Why is it so difficult to agree on what good architecture is? And why is our intuition so good at deciding whether we like a specific building or not? Hi guys, my name is Alex. I'm a registered architect in London, and on this channel we'll look at different tools and strategies to help with our design process. So the question of what constitutes a good architecture is actually quite tricky one to crack, I think. And the way I go about answering this question is kind of a twofold. The first method I can use is the conventional way of going online or reading books and kind of collecting the opinions of different industry leaders and then trying to sort through those opinions and figuring out what my stance is. And this method really relies on the opinion of others. And because that, I think it's somewhat limiting, because in order to find our own voice, we kind of have to somehow come up with our own definition of what good architecture is sometimes. And the way I personally go about it is through the second method, which is more intuitive approach. And basically what I do is I let my gut feeling tell me if I like a specific building or not. But this approach obviously has problems because everybody's intuition is slightly different. Whether I like something or not might be completely different from another person's point of view. But if I really had to explain my intuitive approach and break it down to somebody else, I think it comes down to two things. And it's an assessment of whether building is made up of mainly static spaces or dynamic spaces. And the more dynamic spaces there are in the building, the higher the score is going to be. And so what is dynamic space and what is static space? So a static space is a type of space that I define to be a very basic space. Like, it has the most basic features like a floor, four walls, a ceiling, perhaps a window and a door, and that's pretty much it. Like, it might have some basic decoration, but nothing fancy really. Dynamic space, on the other hand, is a space full of different features, and those features might not necessarily serve a practical purpose, but they are the type of spaces that you'd like to spend your time in. And these can be spaces like foyer spaces in buildings, it can be corridors, it can be theater auditorium spaces, it can be spaces which lead to different spaces and that have irregular shapes and expressive features like columns, decorations, and interesting kind of eclectic and unusual choice of materials and furniture. Now obviously the key here is the balance of those features, because if we just cram a space with different architectural features and furniture and materials, it's not automatically going to guarantee that that space is going to be dynamic space, in my opinion. So a little bit of composure and style is definitely a key element in these. But the point is that the difference between dynamic spaces and static spaces is in that richness of features. And I think the most important type of dynamic space is called a threshold space. And the threshold spaces are really interesting types of spaces because the presence of threshold spaces in the buildings that have very low architectural merit will make us want to spend more time in that building. An example of this are the suburban houses, which are completely, when you look at it from architectural point of view, are very low merit architectural buildings. And if you compare that to buildings that have high architectural merit but don't have threshold spaces, again, those are the types of buildings that we are likely not want to spend any time in. And an example of that would be, for example, Tokyo Capsule, that is a very famous building, but the amount of people who want to live in that building is negligible. So definition of threshold spaces can be quite broad, but I think in the simplest sense, a threshold space is any type of space that facilitates a transition from one area to another. So they're kind of in between spaces, and they're intended to be a kind of connecting tissue between two other spaces. So there are things like stairs, porches, terraces, verandas, and any other type of intermediate spaces that will lead to another spaces. So a well-designed threshold spaces are all about journey rather than destination. A well-designed threshold space will be the type of space where you would want to pause and hang around and appreciate your surroundings, for example. The other point is that they will offer a sense of shelter and privacy a lot of times. So there will be almost like a buffer zone between an external space, for example, and internal private space. And they're the type of spaces that will shelter us from the unwanted people passing by, for example, noise. And with this sense of separation, there will also also act as a low-tech security separation devices. And thirdly, they invoke a sense of curiosity and exploration. Now this is an interesting point because it actually explains why good threshold spaces can be present in any type of buildings and that they don't necessarily have to have a functional dimension. This is why, for example, people are quite fascinated with ruins, because ruins are a series of threshold spaces. When you move through ruins, you move from one zone to another, and there isn't really a delineation between spaces because there are no spaces. There are no functional spaces that you kind of need to get to. The only purpose of going through ruins, if it's an interesting ruin, is to really moving from one point to another. In a sense, it's kind of about the journey rather than destination, as we discussed, but I think it goes a bit deeper than that. It really invokes a deep sense that people have of exploration and a need to see what's kind of on the other side. So a ruin might have different sort of portals where doors used to be, stairs, level and height changes, different nooks and crannies, and irregular shapes of the walls are some of the features that facilitate that curiosity. If you like this video, you might also like this other video that I made that I'll link up over here that talks about a simple geometric hack to improve your architectural design process. In this video, I go through what I like to call a generative design process, which is the type of process that I use to come up with different architectural ideas. So the purpose of that video is really to enable you to come up with more design ideas better, because when it comes to architecture or any art form, the more stuff we can put out there, the higher the chances are that one of those things is actually going to stick, and that's going to be our killer idea, because creative journey is the quantity game rather than the quality game. So yeah, check that video out and I'll see you on the other side.